As I've left this country and visited many, many countries, one of the things that I have found in common is that many believers outside the United States say, well, it's easy to run a company for Christ when you've got a great environment like the U.S. But here, it's a whole different thing. Well, this here is where God has put us. And we are really excited to see what God is doing in the country that has the biggest explosion of births, the biggest explosion on this planet in multiple ways, multiple facets. And it's our pleasure to invite Marian Noronha to come and share with us what God is doing in India.
Thank you. I live in New Hampshire, and I spend about a week or so a year in India, but I spend about another month or so every year in Nepal. And Nepal is the little country between India and China. But a few years ago, while we were launching FCCI in India, as well as I was visiting some other cities and speaking at other audiences, God put this thing on my heart. How many times do we speak to Christians and we say, and they say, but what about bribery? How do you handle it? I said, well, then why don't you just stand up and say, I'm not one of those. Everyone does it, understand, but why don't you number yourself and say, I'm one of those who doesn't do it. And to do that, we came up with a symbol called the No Bribe. We created an organization called the India No Bribe Coalition. We created a symbol, and I said, put that on your business card, so everyone will know who you are. And then, how about listing your name on a website? So we created a website. Now, there's no fancy organization, because to create a fancy organization would have taken so long, and then they'd have asked for bribes to create the organization. So we didn't create the organization. It's kind of a virtual organization. And I'd speak at a chamber of commerce, and they'd say, what a wonderful idea. I said, okay, put your name down. Nice smiles, no signature. So my idea, however, is to start collecting one person at a time until I get to 10. From 10 to 100, 100 to 1,000. If someone says to you, pay me a bribe, you say, I'm not going to pay you, but then 50 people call that guy. 100 people call that guy. Now, what's been happening, so anyways, there's a symbol, that's my business card that I use when I'm in India, and it has the no bribe symbol on it. And about 3 or 4 weeks ago, that showed up on the front page of the Times of India in Bombay and Bangalore, which is a circulation of nearly 2 million people. And if you've been watching the news recently, there's a guy called Hazare who's fashioning himself as a modern-day Gandhi, and he's been driving the government nuts, coming up with legislation that he writes and says, no exceptions, you're going to pass it, or I'm going to fast until I die, on the very spot where Gandhi used to fast, and drove the British nuts. So I've heard that today that legislation was passed. And that legislation actually says that anybody, any minister, all the way up to the prime minister, can be held responsible for a case of bribery. So since most of the people in Congress are crooks anyways, they weren't going to pass this thing anyways. There's a huge pyramid structure by which every bribe, some percentage of every bribe ends up in the re-election campaign of the ruling party. So we got all this publicity recently with Duncan Watkinson, who's our general manager, managing director for India, and he's a British missionary. His daughter is somewhere sitting at the back out there. Wave out, Grace, and there she is. And and we also hired Daniel Devadatta, and we called him an ambassador, and we said, it's time for you to go promoting this thing. And so he ended up getting into the organization of Anna Hazare, and it's ended up with all this publicity, and I'm hoping that more people, especially Christians, are ready to sign up and say, yeah, I'm going to be one of those people. Now, as we've talked about this, some of the FCCI people in Latin America have been talking about it, some folks in Africa, some folks in Malaysia and Indonesia, and I think it's a very simple way in which we can start to make a difference. Another thing we do in Bangalore, we run a Kingdom Enterprise training class. Now, these guys, they're probably high school graduates. They aren't going to make it into any MBA class. But what we're doing is teaching them how to run a Christian company. We run about a 90-day program. We fund it completely. So we have a house that we rent, and all the people who are taking the class live out there together, and we give them a stipend, and we teach them how to run a business, and then we teach them, we're teaching them how to run a Christian business, and how to run a business, and how to be Christians all at the same time. And this is one of the classes that graduated recently. Actually, you'll be very surprised by some of their names. Some of them are from the Assam area right near Burma. Some of them are from the Bombay area, from Bangalore. So it's a great melting pot for them as well. Now, I spent a lot of my time in Nepal because 12 years ago, God put something on my heart in the part of the way I have always expressed the gospel. Was to, when I found out about people living in slavery, I decided, well, let's go buy some and explain the gospel to them. And if they don't get the gospel, I ought to quit trying to teach the gospel. So in 1999, I connected up with some folks in Nepal, and we bought 7 families and set them free, created 3 villages, Faith Town, Hope Town, and Love Town, and settled them. The next year we went back and bought another 35 families, and that created enough of a ruckus in the community that eventually, with some folks going down to the King's Palace and demonstrating in front of the King's Palace, the king declared that slavery was illegal, and that was the end. However, 200,000 people were now kicked off their owner's property, so they had no land, no food, no housing, no jobs. And they also heard that if you stop being a slave, you're given land. So government, where's our land? So the government somehow gave them land. The US government donated some money, and they got some land. But they usually got swamp land, rocky land, absolutely useless stuff. So this is a fast forward through what we are doing out there. That's the Grace School. We have 150 kids. It's now finished 3 years, and those kids are doing beautifully. Meantime, we've picked up another school. We've adopted another school. It's just a mud house right now, but there's a 2-container school being built at Stony Brook School in California, and that will ship out maybe this month, and then we will put 2 of these containers, which have been beautifully decorated by Stony Brook. We'll put them on a foundation, and they will have an instant school. Now, another big problem out there is getting across the river to get to the school, and that's some of my volunteers who were there with me in January. In June, July, August, that river is really difficult to pass. So one of the businesses we're trying to create is a zip line to get across the river. We've sent kids to Goa, where our plant is, for vocational training. We buy goats so that people can start making a living. In fact, the 5 goats right in the back were donated by the president of Cummins Turbo Technologies, my biggest customer. So he proudly displays his goats at Cummins. We've also worked with water treatment systems, trying to get clean, filtered and chlorinated water into the hands of people. This is our Grace School, where the kids now have clean chlorinated water. At another village, we had to dig a pipeline a mile long to get them water. That's the day the water finally flowed. And what do we do? What do we teach? What is our FCCI activity out there? Well, sometimes I'm teaching a guy who buys a watermelon for 60 cents and sells it in slices for 10 cents a slice. I'm trying to teach him cash flow and how to borrow money and how not to borrow money. Sometimes we're teaching them the economics of goats. Marcus Mann, who's also sitting somewhere at the back out there, he's a business teacher. He's a business professor at one of our colleges in New Hampshire. So guess what? He was along to teach us to teach cash flow and to teach compound interest and things like that, to try and help people to stay out of slavery and get out of bondage. Thank you all.